So I think everyone here realizes that when you write a scientific paper, it's a lot of work. First, you have to do the scientific research, then you have to write it up into a paper, and then thirdly, you need to submit it to a journal and actually get it published. And today, I can't actually help you with your research, and I can't help you with writing your papers, but what I can hopefully do is try to help you navigate the peer review process so that when you submit a paper, it's accepted as quickly as possible and with the least amount of pain as possible. So why am I giving this talk? The reason is that I was an editor-in-chief at the Journal of Geophysical Research Planets from roughly 2011 to 2015. And based on my experience, I'm hoping I can share my experience with you to demystify the review process. Okay, so first I'm going to start out with just to give a couple caveats. The first is that the scientific review process is an imperfect process. You should not expect it to work perfectly, but most of the time it will work fairly well. There really is no objective formula or best way of doing things, but it turns out that if you're actually an honest person and good intentioned, and you will probably won't have many problems with the review process. And what I'm going to try to do in this talk is try to show you that if you actually know how the review process works, it will help you to avoid some of the big problems that we encounter when papers are submitted to journals. And some more caveats before I continue. First of all, I have to say that I am no longer an editor for a journal, Geophysical Research Planets. That person is Laurent Montesi. I do not speak on behalf of AGU or JGR Planet, so if I say anything stupid, don't blame them. These are my own personal opinions. Also, the policies at AGU journals and all journals are continuously changing. So I'm basing this talk on when I was an editor about 5 years ago, and things are a little bit different today, but not too different. And also, every single editor is a human being, so every single editor is different. So even when you have two editors at the same journal, you may have slight variance on the review process and a slightly different experience. Okay, so I worked at the JGR Planets, which is a journal of the American Geophysical Union, the AGU. And this slide here is just kind of giving you a top-down hierarchical image of what the people involved in the review process are. And everything above this line right here, I would say, is kind of like politics, and everything below the line is the review process itself. So if we start at the top, we have the AGU Publications Committee. They are the people that are in charge of assigning and picking an editor-in-chief for the journal. And together, these two people, the AGU Publications and editor-in-chief, they are in charge of setting the policy of the journal and determining political things like whether you're going to have press releases or social media presence and so on. This is interesting, but I'm not going to talk about that at all today. So what I'm going to talk about is everything that's below this line. So below this line, we have the editors of the journal, and there's two types of editors. There's the editor-in-chief and the other co-editors, and they're really, in essence, they perform the exact same duties, so there's not much of a difference between these two. And decisions are made by the editor. The editors are employed by AGU, and they typically spend about 1 day per week on editorial duties, so it's not a full-time job. Below this, with the editors, you have the associate editors. For JGR Planets today, there's about 20 associate editors. And associate editors, they are selected by the editors and are actually named on the journal webpage. So they have a tenure of a couple years. And the purpose of the associate editors is to expand the expertise base of the editors in the journal. And the associate editors, they will do things like contact reviewers, and they will recommend a decision to the editor. But it's important to point out that associate editors only make recommendations, and it's the editor that makes the final decision on a paper. And then below this, which are the most numerous, are the reviewers. The reviewers are people who are not associated with AGU, and these are the people that do the bulk of the work in the review process. Okay, so this talk is going to be from an AGU-centric perspective, but I just want to point out that most other journals are very similar to AGU, but there are some differences. One of the big differences is that most other journals don't have associate editors. And for those journals, because of this, what I think happens is that the editor might have to do more work because there's fewer people to rely on. And also these editors, they may have to oversee papers that are from outside of their field of expertise. So I think this is one of the benefits of the AGU editorial structure. Also in the geosciences, it's standard that every paper will be reviewed by 2, sometimes 3 reviewers. But in the planetary sciences, sometimes we get papers that come from the astronomical kind of fields, and those people are used to only dealing with a single reviewer. I don't understand how a journal can only rely on a single reviewer, but this is the standard operating procedure in the astronomical sciences. Also, I would say most journals are run by for-profit corporations. So this would be things like Elsevier and Springer. In contrast, AGU is a non-profit organization, and we, the members of AGU, actually elect the leaders. Also, I would say that most journals they don't pay their editors, but AGU is a little bit different, and they pay a small honorarium. And I would say the small honorarium is not a lot of money. It's a small fraction of your normal salary, but as someone who receives it, it's a motivation to actually do a good job. But the point is that if you're not a full-time employee of AGU, you get a small amount of money, but it's really a small part-time job. Okay, so when you submit a paper to AGU, what happens? Well, the first thing is it goes to a secretary, and they just make sure that you submitted all the files correctly. And then after this, they send the paper to the editor-in-chief. And then the editor-in-chief decides which of the roughly 4 or 5 editors in the journal would be the most qualified to oversee the review process of that manuscript, mostly based on just the similarity and the expertise of the paper and the editor. And then at this point, there's a kind of a branch in the decision process, and the editor determines whether he wants to manage the review process entirely by himself, or whether he's going to get an associate editor involved to help with the review process. And the reason you would get an associate editor involved is that the associate editor might have a better expertise in the field of the manuscript that was submitted. So when there's an associate editor involved, the associate editor will contact the reviewers. They will read the reviews when they come back, and then they will make a recommendation to the editor as to what to do with the manuscript. And it's important to point out here is that this is really a recommendation. It's not binding, and it's the editor himself who makes the final publication decision. So if you ever get really mad at the review process or a journal or something, don't get mad at the reviewers. Don't get mad at the associate editor. Just get mad only at the editor, because the editor is responsible for the integrity of the entire review process. Okay, so when you submit a paper, how long does it take to actually get your paper reviewed and finally published? Well, most journals, they actually care about this because they know that scientists are unhappy when the review process takes a long time. So many times, maybe sometimes on their website, they actually publish the statistics of how much time it takes to get from when you submit the manuscript to when you get the first decision and the final decision, which is when the paper is published. And for JGR Planets, these numbers are actually pretty good. When I was there, it took about 50 days to get your first decision, and roughly twice that, about 100 days, until your paper gets a final decision to either publish it or reject it. Now, this is, I would say, substantially quicker than most other journals. And in my opinion, you can't really do much better than these numbers. And the reason is that the reviewers are the weak link in the review process, and we can't force the reviewers to review papers more quickly. So in any case, when you submit a paper, the take-home message on this slide is, don't worry for 60 days, for 2 months, just remain calm. And after 2 months, then you can start worrying, and you might want to look on the journal website to see where your manuscript is in the review process. Okay, so when you actually get a decision letter from the editor, it will probably be one of 4 things: either accept, minor revision, major revisions, or reject. And I think most of these things are fairly self-explanatory, but there are some subtleties that you need to be aware of. So first of all, when we accept a paper, what does this mean? It actually means that the paper is accepted as is, and you cannot make any more changes to the manuscript. So if you were hoping to, write a little bit more text, or if you were hoping to add a new figure or some new references, in general, you shouldn't do that. And in general, you need to ask the editor if it's okay to make modifications after the manuscript is accepted. Secondly, for minor revisions, what this usually means is that your manuscript should be able to be published in roughly about about 1 month. So you need to roughly 1 month to make the revisions. And after this, it's generally not necessary to re-review the manuscript. Sometimes, but not always. The next decision is major revisions. And in general, what this means is that it will take you about 2 months to make the revisions in order to submit it back to the journal. So for me, the only difference between major and minor revisions is just the amount of time it's going to take you to make the revisions. It's not really it doesn't really have anything to do with the quality of the manuscript. It's just a question of how much time you need to make the changes to the manuscript. Now, usually with major revisions, your manuscript will be sent back for re-review, but that's not always the case. And then finally, there's a reject. And for this one, you need to be really careful because there's many reasons why your paper might be rejected. And I would say only 1 or 2 of these reasons is actually bad. So the first is that your paper just might not be in the scope of the journal. And this is a common thing what happens in planetary science, where we have people who do more kind of engineering things, where they work on instrumentation, and they submit it to a journal like JGR Planets, and then they realize later that it's not really the best journal for that type of manuscript. So your paper might be rejected, and it has nothing to do with the quality of the manuscript. Another reason is that your revisions might be taking too long. As I mentioned above, usually we take 1 or 2 months to revise a manuscript. But if it's going to take you a year to make the revisions, most likely the editor is either going to reject or withdraw or do something like that to your manuscript. That's not necessarily bad. The third reason is that the revisions may be so there might be so many revisions that the revised manuscript may be substantially different from the initially submitted version. And in this case, it's just better to treat it as a new submission and find new reviewers. One reason, which is actually bad, is that when the authors refuse to take into account the reviewer's comments, in this case, you're forcing the hand of the editor. In this case, the editor has no choice but just to reject the manuscript. And then the last reason, which is the worst one, is that your paper is just not any good and doesn't meet the standards of the journal. Someone had a question, the average day for the minor revisions or time to first submission was 48 days. Why 60 days is a recommendation to wait to be calm. This 48 days that I mentioned, this is the numbers that I had when I was the editor-in-chief. And this fluctuates from year to year and from editor to editor. So I actually don't know what the current statistic is for the current editor at JGR, but I'm fairly confident that it's roughly the same. And also I would say that this is the average time. So if the time to get a decision is a Gaussian distribution, if you go 1 sigma above, it's going to be, roughly probably 60, 65, 70 days. So this is why I suggested to wait to 60 days before freaking out. In the planetary sciences, we have 2 reviewers, and many people think that the publication decision is just a simple arithmetic average of the 2 reviews. Now, in practice, this may be the case, but in reality, what happens is that the editor makes an independent assessment of the reviews and the assessment of the associate editor and makes an independent decision. And the reason for this is that sometimes the reviewers are just too harsh. Sometimes the reviewers are too lenient. And what the editors try to do is they kind of try to normalize the quality of the reviews that come in. And this is very hard, but what they're trying to do is just to kind of make the acceptance criteria of the journal uniform from paper to paper. And sometimes, you'll get 2 reviews which suggest major revisions, but the editor and associate editors will look at the paper and the reviews and you'll just say, no, those 2 reviewers were just too hard, and it's actually minor revisions. So it's just to point out that the publication decision is not an average of the reviewers, it's really an independent assessment of the editorial staff. Okay, so once you get the reviews back, what you have to do is revise your paper and then also write a rebuttal to the journal as to how you changed your manuscript. And I'd say this is a step where you can make the editor's life significantly easier and actually speed up the review process. And so I'm going to say that there's probably 4 things you need to do to make it an effective rebuttal. So the first thing is, you just want to write 1 paragraph which kind of summarizes the gist of the 2 reviews. And this is just to tell the editor, we took into account all the comments. Or you might say, we took into most of the comments, but there's 1 or 2 which we'll describe below later in the rebuttal, which we didn't because we don't agree with what they said. So just 1 paragraph just to give a brief overview. Secondly, what you want to do is you want to copy the entire text of all of the reviews and all of the editor correspondence. And then following this, in this single manuscript, what you want to do is every time the editor or the reviewers make a comment, you want to immediately after that describe what you did. Did you change the manuscript? Is the comment wrong? Or maybe you don't need to change the manuscript, or maybe you do. Now, if you do change the manuscript, what I suggest you do is that you copy the new text into the rebuttal letter. And the reason for this is that this is going to make the editor's life a lot easier, because the editor has the original manuscript, they have the 2 reviews, they have your rebuttal, and then you have your revised manuscript. And it's very difficult for the editor to switch between all these 4 different PDFs to make sure that you actually did revise the manuscript the way you did. So just as an example, instead of saying something like, we made the changes on page X of the paper, you can say, here is the revised text that can be found on page X. And this will make the editor's life a lot easier and will speed up the review process because of this. Okay, so sometimes you get bad reviews. And the question is, what do you do about this? So you might get some reviews that are just confusing. You might get reviews that are very biased. And occasionally, but not often, you will get mean reviews. So what do? The first thing is you really need to wait 1 or 2 days before you contact the editor. The last thing that you want to do is contact the editor 5 or 10 minutes after you get the email with the decision on your manuscript. Because if you do this, you're just going to be mad and you're going to say some dumb things. And when I was the editor, I was surprised at how many times I would get a response from the authors of the manuscript within the day or within even minutes to after you sent off the email. So first thing is just cool down for 1 or 2 days and try to come up with the strategy as to how to address the reviews. And secondly, if you are confused about what the reviewers are saying, you should really just ask the editor to give you a summary of what they want you to do. Because sometimes the reviews are not clear and it's not obvious what questions they are asking in the review. And in this case, it's better that you ask the editor to get guidance than it is to just guess and then find out later that you guessed wrong. So just ask the editor. It'll make the editor's life easier in the long run, and it will help you and get your manuscript accepted more quickly. Okay, this is another question that I'll often get once you get your reviews back. Do the editors and associate editors read all the papers? Now, since this presentation is being recorded, I'm actually not going to answer this question, but I just ask you that you do the following math. So most editors are going to handle about 100 or more articles per year. They're going to handle each of the revisions, which is generally 1 or 2 revisions. they're going to have to read all the reviews, the rebuttals, and the associate editor recommendations. And on top of this, the editors are working only part-time, roughly 1 day per week. So add up the amount of time to read all this correspondence and ask yourself whether it's physically possible for an editor to read every single manuscript. Now, what I will say is that someone will read your manuscript. The associate editors, they generally have more free time than the editors do. And whenever there is a problem with the manuscript, you can be assured that the editors will read your manuscript in those cases. Okay, so the first part of my talk was mostly about the review process from the perspective of someone who is submitting a manuscript to a journal. And I'm just going to switch gears for a couple of slides to talk about how the review process from the perspective of a reviewer. So once you start writing papers, you will start to get invitations to review manuscripts. Oftentimes, what happens is that your thesis advisor will be too busy to review a paper, and he will ask the editor to send the manuscript to his former student. So this is generally what happens. And so when you're asked to review, what's the best way to approach this? Well, it turns out that in this case, there is a clear formula that works. And it's the following. It's just a 4-step process. The first thing is that you want to write a single paragraph, just summarizing the paper and why it's important. And the reason for this, believe it or not, is just to convince the editor that you actually read the paper and you understand what it's about. Secondly, you're going to write another individual paragraph which describes your recommendations. That here you will say whether the manuscript could be accepted as is, whether it needs minor changes, which you'll describe later, or whether there are certain things that absolutely need to be done before it can be considered for publication. And then after this, that's very important, is that you take all of your comments and you divide it into 2 categories. One will be the major comments and the other will be the minor comments. And then you want to provide these as a list in your review, and the list should be numbered. And the reason you want to number the list is because authors are sometimes very sneaky. Number all of your comments, it makes it very hard for them to, in essence, to remove one of your comments from the rebuttal. So it's just a pro tip, is just number all your comments, and this will ensure that the authors will have to really address your comment. Okay, so with the major review, the authors of the manuscripts really address these concerns, and you should really expect that the editor will make sure that your major comments are taken into consideration. On the other hand, your minor comments, these things most likely do not need to be read by the editor. And most of these minor comments will be simple things like typos, there'll be suggestions or matters of opinion. So, you should expect that the author will read the minor comments, and most likely they will take those suggestions into consideration, but you really shouldn't expect that the editor will enforce that every single minor comment is addressed in the revised manuscript. Okay, so how not to write a review. So this is, again, very simple from my perspective. The first thing is, don't write a review which is long sections of text in paragraph form. You really need to be concise. And the reason for this is that if you use long paragraphs, it is often very, very hard to understand what is the actionable item that you're doing. So just be very concise, or have a bullet. Secondly, don't write an extremely short review. On the other hand, in this case, the editor is just going to assume that you are too busy to review the manuscript properly, and they might not take the review, they might not really give the weight to your review that they should be given to. And then lastly, this should be self-evident, but please don't insult anyone and try to be constructive in your reviews. I understand that sometimes science is very competitive, and you get in a competitive mode, and you sometimes think people aren't as intelligent as you are, but this doesn't help anyone in a review process, and it's just going to make people mad. So just try to be as constructive and professional as possible. Okay, so when you do review a paper, should you sign your name to the review? Now, this is something that's really important and you really need to consider. And in my opinion, most reviews should almost always be anonymous. Now, this is my opinion, and we can have debates for hours as to whether anonymous versus signed reviews are better. But in general, I think this avoids a lot of problems. And most of these problems relate to the fact that there are differences in age between the reviewer and the author of the manuscript. There's differences in seniority. There may be personal relationships. You may be friends with the person. And this just can make signing your name to the review awkward. So my suggestion is just don't sign your name. It solves everything. So another reason is that, this is something I know from personal experience as well, is that people can hold grudges for a long time when their manuscript is rejected. So if you don't want to piss off a colleague for 10 years into the future, just don't sign your name if you write a mean or if you suggest that their manuscript should be rejected. Also, a lot of problems that come about is because there are differences in age between the reviewers and the authors of the manuscript. So, for example, a younger reviewer might not want to write a bad review of a paper from a senior scientist because they might be worried that this will have some negative repercussions in the future. So just don't sign your name in this case. Similarly, many times, senior scientists, if they don't know who the reviewer is, and if they know that as a young reviewer, a young scientist, they might not take that person's opinion very seriously. Now, I know this is wrong, but this happens often. So in this case, if you're a young scientist reviewing a senior scientist paper, just don't sign your name, and it will resolve this problem. The scientist will have to address your comments based on the merit, as opposed to whether they think you're intelligent or not. And then lastly, many people think that they are the experts in a certain domain, and that if you sign your name, the author will have to take your opinion more seriously because they know who you are. Now, I just question whether this happens because, if I am the expert in some kind of small gravity analyses working with planets, I'm certain that there are people that just don't like me or whatever reason. And if they know who I am, they might not take my opinion seriously, even though I am the only expert in that field. So just don't sign your name. It's going to resolve all these problems. Okay, so I just have a couple of final thoughts before I end, and then we can go on to some questions. First of all, when you submit a manuscript to a journal, don't do it until the manuscript is finished. So many people, they will submit a manuscript and they will say, oh, well, there's a couple of things that we'll need to fix, during the review process. But the problem is that this just extends the duration of the review process, because you will maybe get major revisions. It may be harder to find people to review their paper because they don't like the fact that the paper is not finished. So my advice is just by taking one extra month of time to finish the paper properly, you can often shorten the review process by 2 months. So just take the time to do properly, and when you submit it and the manuscript's done, it will go through the review process more smoothly. Second final thought is that when you submit a manuscript, they often ask you to recommend reviewers for your manuscript. And this is extremely important. And this is because it's really hard as an editor to find qualified reviewers. Many reviewers are just busy. Sometimes the editor will get, say I'm a geophysicist and I'm given a paper to review, which is by a petrologist. It's going to be hard for me to find the names of people to ask to review the manuscript. And what I can tell from experience is that every time a reviewer declines an invitation, it takes about 1 extra week to find another reviewer. So if we have to decline, so if 4 people decline to review your manuscript in a row, that's going to add 1 month to the review process. So what I would suggest is that when you make recommendations for reviewers, you should consider whether these reviewers will have the time to do the work, and whether they're interested and whether they would like to review your manuscript. And I would suggest that you suggest both young and established reviewers, because oftentimes it's the younger people that have the time and who are more motivated than the more established senior scientists. Okay, a third final thought is that if you ever encounter problems in post-production after your manuscript is accepted, you really need to contact the editor. And the reason for this is after an editor accepts your manuscript, it goes into a black hole and they never see it again. They have no idea what happens to your manuscript. And there are lots of things that can go wrong in the post-production process. The post-production people, they will reformat your paper, they will reformat your equations, they will change acronyms, they will do things like change GA for billions of years ago to GY for billions of years. And this is just because those people in the post-production process, they're just not familiar with our field of research. And they can make mistakes, and oftentimes they make pretty bad mistakes. So if you ever have problems in post-production, contact the editor. The editor will get involved and he will resolve the problem for you. And lastly, this is something that's a question we get a lot of times from people from developing countries, is that they can't actually afford to publish. They can't actually afford the publication fees for journals, top-notch journals like JGR Planets or Icarus or things like that. To publish a manuscript in the AGU journal, it's going to cost on the order of $3,000 to $5,000 US dollars, and that's a lot of money for some people. Now, if you know in advance that you can't afford it, that should not stop you from submitting your manuscript to the journal. You should either just contact the editor in advance to see if there's a way to waive some of the publication fees, because at least with AGU, they will waive the fees for some people. I don't know what that percentage is of how many people they waive the fees for. I've asked and they never have given me a number, but I know that they do waive the publication fees for some people. And the journal is not going to want to lose a paper just because of money. So, if you're going to have a problem with paying, ask the editor either in advance of submission of the manuscript or during the review process, just to let them know there may be a problem. And this is something that actually may affect either people with lots of money, because sometimes if say you're a senior scientist involved with the planetary mission and your research lab sends 10 manuscripts to a special issue, and then you get the bill back from AGU and it's $100,000, sometimes that's a lot of money. So there are arrangements that can be made, and the publications staff can waive some of the fees for your manuscripts. Okay, so that's all I really have to say in this presentation, and I'm happy to talk about any of the topics that I went through beforehand. And I could easily talk hours about every single slide that I gave in this presentation. And if you have any questions, I'll be here for a half hour or so. And if you are shy, I actually put up some pre-questions that you may want to ask in this slide here. So thank you very much.